Hi everyone. I'm Jo Lynch from the ANPC, Business Manager, and I'd like to
I'm
introduce Chantel.
Hi everyone. I'm Chantel. I'm going to be running this little session for the next 4 hours. First of all, thanks very much for joining, and I will remind you that this session is being recorded. I'll give you the link a little bit later on. So before we commence, I would like to pay respect and acknowledge our First Nations custodians from the land on which we're all joining. If you could please add your acknowledgement in the chat, that would be appreciated. I would like to pay my respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose country I'm joining from today. And I would also like to recognise the ongoing connection to and caring for country. I'd also like to pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people joining today. Thank you. I also need to acknowledge that today we are discussing fire ecology, but there is terrible devastation occurring because of fire in Maui currently and loss of life. We can't escape sometimes the catastrophic impacts of climate change. We know that megafires are going to increase in frequency, and part of our preparedness is having the courage to have days like these to learn and to begin to plan. So before I get underway, one more thanks. A thank you to the University of New South Wales, who have provided the funding today that has made this free for everyone and also means that it'll be stored on the ANPC YouTube channel. As I said, my name is Chantel. I'm a project manager from the Australian Network for Plant Conservation, and I'm also completing a PhD at the University of New South Wales. I'm going to be chairing the symposium. You'll see my face quite a lot and you'll get sick of hearing me. Behind the scenes, we've got Jo Lynch. She's going to be running the Zoom, and also Richie, who you can't see, but I promise you he's there. If you have any problems, please put them in the chat and Jo and Richie will help you out. So a few comments about how the program is going to run. The program has recently been updated with a few changes. It's on the website, but Jo can put the link in the chat. Today's session is being recorded with the exception of a few presenters that have requested not to be recorded, and you'll be able to access that at any time via the ANPC YouTube. Jo can put the link in the chat. We've disabled audio for attendees. I'm sorry about that, but we've got quite a few people here today. But you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A tab. You should be able to find the Q&A tab, and all of the presenters will be able to respond to that in writing, but also at the end of each session, we're going to have a live 10-minute Q&A session so that they can answer as well. I just have to say that this symposium came about as a vote from our last symposium about translocation, from our members saying that people wanted to hear about plants and fire. A big thank you to everyone that has given their time and expertise today to participate. All of our presenters have amazing knowledge. If you would like a different topic and a different symposium, at the end of this, we're going to be sending out another feedback form so you can tell us what else you are interested in ANPC producing. With that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Mark Ooi. He's our first presenter. Mark, while I'm giving you a little spiel, it gives you the opportunity to share your screen. So please go ahead and share your screen. Now, Dr. Mark Ooi, as I said, is our first presenter. He's a plant ecologist and a Scientia Senior Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales. Mark has decades of experience in seed ecology and consequently plant and fire relationships. He's leading a team dedicated to the research of fire and plant ecology and is going to be warming us up today by giving us an overview of some of the principles of Australian plants and their relationships with fire. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks everyone for joining us online today. Particularly a big thanks to Sean, Jo, and the other ANPC people for bringing this symposium/workshop together. So I'm going to talk very briefly about plants and post-fire recovery. And the reason this is a really important thing for us to look at is that fire regimes and fires are changing. We know, am I moving forward there? Oh, hang on. There we go. So it's one of the most spectacular impacts of climate change. And you can see here, this is from the 2019-2020 fires. flame heights there must be around 30 meters. But I think one of the things to really remember with this idea of fire regime, climate change, and everything is it's global. And so over the last few years, the rest of the world has been experiencing very much what we have as well. Throughout Europe, Spain, France, Greece, they've all experienced consecutive record-breaking fires between around 2014, 15 up through to now. California in the last 10 years has experienced 15 of the biggest fires on record, all just in that single state. So this is a global phenomenon. What we do have to remember as well is that this is a devastating thing, particularly when it's life and property. As Sean's already mentioned, the impacts on that are happening in Maui now, the impacts we had from the 2020 fires, these are all devastating: loss of life, loss of property. When we think of biodiversity impacts of fire, it's a very complex thing. It's not purely devastation, and it's not purely good. It's all around this very complex interaction between fire regime and many other environmental and climate factors that all come into it. And this is something we really have to remember when we think about trying to understand the impacts on our ecosystems, on plants, on the component species as well. So we need to understand both the ways that fire regimes are changing, but also if we're trying to figure out which are the winners and losers as far as plant species are concerned, and then the bits that they make up into communities and the ecosystems. We need to understand the traits, the different elements that make those, that produce the response of those species to the shifting fire regimes. So a very brief look at some of the types of work that we've been doing in response to this. And this is from the 2020 fires. This work from Tom LeBreton, who's going to be talking a bit later today. Is from his PhD that he's finishing with us. And Tom, as we all know now, that during the 2020 fires, we had around 7 million hectares burnt in the southeast of Australia. It's not just that extent, it's the fact that they were of such high severity over such a large extent. They overran into areas that aren't burnt that often, and so also overran areas that had been burnt by other fires quite recently. So it basically increased the amount that different formations and different vegetation classes are under threshold. So all those red and yellow colours there are all areas that are now under threshold as a result of that single fire season. But like I was saying, the large extent that was burnt at such extreme severity is the important thing here. Fire regimes, wildfires always have hot parts in any wildfire. There's going to be a patch that burns pretty hot. What we're talking about is extreme severity over landscape scales. And what we wanted to find out is what sort of impact does that have? Which species are going to be most at risk just as a result of something like that single factor increasing severity? And so work with Ryan Tangney, led by Alex Thompson and others also from my group, is going out and looking at species seedling recruitment after moderate, high, or extreme severity fire. So we went out and counted across the landscape just the amount of seedlings coming up. And you can see in that black and white figure on the left there, as you go from left to right, the amount of seedlings coming up in moderate severity compared to extreme severity on the right, there's a big drop. And it's like, okay, so we're losing some species from this recruitment, at least lowering their abundance. So which species are they? Which species are a problem? We then split them into dormancy classes. Red is physically dormant and blue is physiologically dormant, but basically they're related to seed size as well. We're finding that those blue colored bars there, the smaller seeded species tend to be the ones that are dropping out at extreme fire severity. So already from this, looking at this single trait, this seed trait, we're able to get a better idea of which species may be more in trouble from these extreme severity fires and what we can do then to focus on perhaps looking at them for more research, targeting for restoration or at least monitoring. So the 2020 fires here and fires all around the world are basically providing a footprint of really complex fire history. And one of the things it does for us as researchers is it provides this canvas so that we can have a look at all these different interacting factors of the fire regimes as they shift past the thresholds that currently we've known. So with it, we've got more extreme fires, we've got higher fire frequency. What's that going to do for the species that persist in these systems? What's also has been going on the last little while is provided impetus for hands-on restoration and conservation efforts. There's funding at the moment, and there's a push to support and understand what's going on. And that's the same also, and there'll be many talks later on today around this. The same for looking at frameworks. Tony Auld, Tom, Rachel Gallagher and others are going to talk about this sort of thing, increasing our ability to better prioritise species through identifying those at risk. But all of this really depends on keeping an understanding that fires are with us and they're changing at quite a high rate. And we need to keep this in our psyche. At the moment, it's still there, but we have surprisingly short memories. And that goes not just for us as community people, but also those in power and those that have the funding purse strings. So we need to make sure that we have events like this, that we keep understanding that fires are part of what we're experiencing and their shift. And we need to keep that going. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And thanks for introducing the concept of extreme severity as well and why it might be a concern. It's probably useful for our next presenter, Professor Tony Auld, who, aside from having many affiliations, as you can see in the program, is going to be summarising a framework that was developed for identifying priority plants that were impacted by the 2019-2020 megafires. The framework's obviously retrospective, but it can be used to inform future planning of most at-risk species and vegetation communities. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Mark, for giving some background for some of the things I want to talk about today. So really, I want to just go over, why are fires important in driving plant and animal populations, and how we can think about that in a framework to look at what are our priorities for conservation. So why are changing fire regimes an issue? We've essentially had fires for millions of years in the Australian landscape, but things are changing and changing quite rapidly at the present. So, sorry, I'll clear that note off. We had changing climates for millions and thousands of years. As the continent moved north and dried out, we had the arrival of Indigenous Australians who applied fire management in the country. More recently, we've had the arrival of the Europeans, changed fire regimes again, also cleared and fragmented a lot of the landscapes. So it changed where fires can go, changed where the refugia from fires are. We also use fire as a tool for protection of life and property now. So some areas get a lot more fire because we're trying to reduce the fuel loads around places where people are. We've changed ignition sources for fire. And we're currently, as Mark said, in a period of rapid global warming where we've got more chance of severe fire weather, more chance of severe drought, all leading to what we think are more severe and more frequent fires occurring. So rather than picking a sort of a time period in the past, we have to kind of think about how to deal with things as these changes occur and understand just how plants and animals respond to fire so we can help think about their fire management for conservation. So recently, the Commonwealth's Threatened Species Scientific Committee has listed fire regimes that cause declines in biodiversity as a key threatening process. They recognise that things are changing and this can impact on biodiversity. So if you look at the image on the left-hand side there, you'll see several components are important. Mark touched on the fire regime, and I'll touch on a few elements of that in a minute, and also the spatial extent that fires occur in. But other things influence how well plants and animals do in relation to fire, and they include predators, herbivores, competitors such as weeds and diseases. They include abiotic things such as whether there's been a drought before or after a fire, floods and heavy rainfall, how the landscape's changed, whether it's been cleared, whether it's been logged, whether there are other disturbances in that landscape. What we do in terms of fire suppression, whether we add retardants, whether we modify the behaviour of vegetation to reduce the risk of fire spreading, and obviously overlaid on top of all this is the warming climate that we're facing at the moment. So what we tried to do after the 2019 fires was to say, how can we combine all these interacting elements together to look at just what's at risk in terms of plants and ecosystems and help guide where our conservation priorities should be. So we looked at this in kind of with three key elements. First of all, we wanted to understand what are the mechanisms that cause species declines, and they relate to some of these elements we see on the table, on the figure on the left. We wanted to know how sensitive species or ecosystems were to these mechanisms. So different species are going to have different sensitivities. Different species are going to have different conditions that they exist in, be it in terms of predators or herbivores, be it in terms of they're in drought or they're in a wet area. But we also wanted to look at how exposed they are in the landscape to particular fire events. And Mark gave a good indication of that in his talk about the extent of the 2019-20 wildfires, and that much of the distribution of many species was exposed to that particular fire event. But we tried to combine these three elements to look at prioritisation of what things were at risk. And I'll just take you through a couple of very quick examples on a couple of those elements to show you some of the mechanisms involved. So the first one is fire frequency, which essentially affects plant recruitment and survival. So the first dot point is kind of for things that are killed by fire. So you imagine whenever they're burnt, all the plants you see above ground are killed. And these sort of plants rely on seed germination after a fire. And they need intervals between fires that are long enough to allow those seed banks to recover. And the example I've got at the bottom, the pictures, is a Banksia from southwest Sydney. See a plant on the left, when you burn it, it's just kind of a dead stick in the middle here. And hopefully after fire, you get these seedlings coming up. And what happened after the 2019 fire was, some cases, this plant on the left, you'll notice it's got lots of flowers, but it's got no fruits on it. So when you burn this plant, you get a dead stick, but you get no seedlings. And so what happened at a number of sites for this species was there's virtually no recruitment going on. So there's been fire too frequently and a bit of drought effects that's reduced the capacity of that species to recover after fire because there's no seed bank. Now, it's not just obligate seeders that can be affected by frequent fire. Even resprouters can be. They need to recruit between fires occasionally, especially if there's high mortality after drought in fires. So imagine this picture at the bottom right is a bunch of resprouting seedlings of a Banksia rather than this particular one. They need to grow a lignotuber under the ground that's big enough to survive when the next fire occurs. And if you burn it too frequently, you can just knock them all out. So again, you'll see a decline in the population. So that's a kind of couple of mechanisms by which species can be affected adversely by fire frequency. Further, anything that resprouts uses its stored reserves to recover. So the more fires you have, the less ability it has to replenish those stored reserves. And so you also get more mortality and less capacity to resprout in those sorts of species with increasingly frequent fire. At the other end of the spectrum, there's impacts of infrequent fire, but I won't really go into them today. I just want to point out they do exist. And the second example I want to give is the fire severity. And Mark, again, touched on this nicely. And most people think that severe fires are bad for biodiversity. And I just want to say that that's not quite true and not always the case. There are good and bad things about it. There are some things that kind of need severe fires to persist in the environment. One example is plants that require a degree of soil heating to promote germination. That may be in combination with other things such as smoke cues. A couple of examples here are Hardenbergia violacea and the critically endangered Grevillea calii. And just expanding on the Grevillea, all the plants above ground again are killed by fire, and some work has shown that you get quite good recruitment after severe fires, but not much recruitment or no recruitment after low severity fires. Now, of course, once the fires get too severe, as Mark said, we may reduce these blue bars down and make them more like the orange bars. But at the moment, severe fires seem to be the thing that favours this species. Of course, many things are killed by fire and it sets back systems quite a bit. So there's strong interactions between fire severity and fire frequency. So on the left, we have a long-lived Xanthorrhoea grass tree killed by a severe fire. And when you knock out really old plants, you need to replace them. And on the right, we have a eucalypt woodland that's got a whole lot of mortality in it, but a lot of trees reduced to basal resprouting or resprouting from very low on the trunks. So the whole structure of that community has been changed after the fire. And in a severe fire, it takes much longer for that community to recover than in a low severity fire. So there's a strong interaction between fire severity and fire frequency. The same occurs in species that are relatively sensitive to burning. Here's the wild pine, another critically endangered plant. It only experienced a relatively low severity fire in 2019-20, some scorching up the trunks. But we did see on the right here burning at the base of trees that caused rotting at the base of the trees, and a number of trunks died because of this. So in this species, it requires low severity fires, but very, very long periods between fires if it's going to tolerate and persist under a fire regime. So what we came up with in our framework was to say, we have these fire regimes, we have all these components that are important to predict whether a species or an ecosystem can survive and recover. We put them together to look at priorities. Rachel Gallagher did some work on this for all Australian plants, and that's now published. David Keith did some work leading on this for all Australian ecosystems. So there's 2 bits of work that have come out of this using the framework to look at priorities. And then we start thinking about what are the management actions that go with those priorities. And those management actions largely depend on the nature of the sensitivity and the nature of the effects of different things. So if you've got herbivores, you might want to do some immediate fencing. If you've got myrtle rust killing regrowth, you may want to do some germplasm collection as soon as possible. So there are different things you may need depending on the nature of the threats. So hopefully today we'll get to see some more examples of this sort of thing. And you can think about it in terms of a framework of how you might think about conservation priorities. And I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Our next presenter is Ecology, and is going to provide an overview of the diversity of relationships between seeds and fire, and how his work identifying those relationships isn't as straightforward as imagined in the past. And these ideas of thresholds and severity are going to come up again, I imagine. Thanks very much, Ryan. Oh, how are you going sharing your screen there? Yep, he's on mute.
Thanks, Sean. I'm not going to talk about seed thresholds today. I've decided to talk about changes in fire season and how that changes post-fire recovery success. This work, I'm from WA and I work in WA, so this work is carried out in the southwest of Western Australia. Yeah, so let's jump into it. So as we know that fire, as Mark alluded to, fire is a global problem, and as climate change impacts increase, so do the impacts of wildfire. So we see this all around the world, and including into southwest WA, we are impacted by wildfires, including during 2019-20 when the Stirling Range National Park was burnt during the summer of 2019-20, with 1/3 of the park being burnt within the summer. But in fire-prone ecosystems, plants are adapted to recruit profusely following fire. In southwest WA, however, we are seeing a distinct change in fire season as rainfall during winter months is declining. In some cases, down to 85% of the winter rainfall is declining. That's resulting in an annual decrease of 286 millimetres across the year, ultimately affecting the recharge into dams, with a dam recharge decline of 254 gigalitres. And coupled with the increase in annual temperature, we see that southwest WA has been rapidly under the effects of climate change since the mid-1970s. However, we know that plants are adapted to fire regimes. As Mark and Tony have alluded to, fire regimes are comprised of severity, frequency, season, and extent. And my focus today is solely on fire season and understanding how fire season impacts can change post-fire recruitment. This we started down this path in 2019, I believe. This is a paper that a colleague of mine, Russell Miller, led for his PhD, and we identified 7 mechanisms of where we believe fire seasonality will be most impactful on plant populations. 6 of these are on the recruitment angle, and those 6 of the 7 are also a kind of seed-focused elements. We've talked about this a lot. So we wrote another paper and another paper and another paper where we're really just trying to pull apart these at an increasingly granular level the effects of fire season. But then we're left with this one critical question: does it make a measurable difference? To answer this question, we set out and did a meta-analysis. So we gained papers from across the world that have asked very similar questions, and we found that overwhelmingly there is a significant decrease in recruitment because there is a mismatch in seasonal timing requirements of germination and dormancy release. When we drill down, we find that this is particularly problematic for olive seeding species from woodlands, shrublands, and forests. To put this a bit more in perspective, in southwest WA, we are a strongly seasonal climate with all our rainfall in winter mainly. So Casey Ryan here, a master's student, went out and followed post-fire recruitment following an autumn fire and a spring fire. And he found that in the first 8 months following an autumn fire, we see good germination and recruitment. But in the first 8 months of following a spring fire, we see no recruitment at all, a significant lag. And this can be best explained by these, I guess, a germination window approach, where we see that following the autumn fire in May, the seeds are exposed to cool, wet temperatures that promote germination, while the fire in October there, that dotted line, indicates a spring fire, and subsequent to that, the seeds in the seed bank are exposed to hot, dry temperatures, not conducive to germination and emergence. So in strongly seasonal WA climates, autumn fire leads to good germination, while spring fire results in a lag of germination. We're left with a second question, or more questions. At a longer recovery period and at a larger scale, do we see these effects of fire seasonality persist, and do they interact with fire seasonality at all? So enter the Southern Jarrah Forest and what we've termed the brute force approach. The Southern Jarrah Forest is comprised of jarrah trees across a large swath of southwest WA. What's unique about this part of the world is that we do a lot of prescribed burning. In 2020, during the grips of COVID, we were still able to burn or treat 60,000 hectares. In 2021, it was 47,000 hectares. So this allows us a big approach that we can select these burns and aim towards a balanced experimental approach where we can sample autumn and spring fires. Also, what's unique is it's amazingly diverse, both in species composition and also structurally. Both those 2 photos there of the broader forest are of the same post-fire age. So we can see that there's quite a diversity in structure and composition. So to pull apart the effects of fire season, we really we selected these 12 fires here, 6 of those in spring, 5 in autumn, and we got 1 wildfire down that bottom right-hand corner there. The total area of these fires is 33,695 hectares. So a significant area that we used in this experiment. Drilling down, we placed plots in each in severity types. So 10 plots per fire, per severity, per a total of 30 plots per fire. Yep, right there. So we have 180 plots in 2020 and 180 plots in 2021 for a total of 360 plots that we've measured annually since 2020. Today, I'm just going to focus on the 120 plots that we set up in 2020 because that allows us a couple of years of post-fire germination and recruitment and stuff like that. So let's get stuck in. So in 2020, autumn fires produce a flush of germination like we expected, and it's compared to spring, which is negligible. Looking at 2021, we see a recovery in spring germination and a decline in autumn survival. And in 2022, when both treatments have experienced one whole summer, we see a moderately equal effect, but still autumn fires produce higher germination, so higher recruitment after 2 years, independent of fire severity. So here we look at the mortality of across those plots, and in the first, between the difference between first and second year. Negative numbers here indicate that the plants are dying. So we see a significant decline in seedling number following autumn fires in the first summer, and a significant increase in seedling number in spring fires. In the subsequent 2 years, so 2 to 3 year period, we see a very little mortality. So this gives us hope that the spring fires do recover to an equal level, despite not having the same flush of germination in the first year. However, when we look at it in the third year, independent of fire severity, we see that overwhelmingly spring germination is reduced compared to autumn germination. And there is no interaction at that interaction. Yeah, if we break it down by fire response type, we can see that resprouting plants that can resprout as well as seed, do overwhelmingly better than the fire-killed species. Again, independent of fire severity, and by dormancy class, similar patterns. So irrespective of their dormancy class, we see a similar pattern. Autumn produces higher recruitment than spring fires. So this is the model we're working with currently. So following an autumn fire, the seeds immediately are exposed to suboptimal temperatures that reduce inappropriate germination. So when optimal conditions arise in the subsequent winter, the recruitment comes in a flush because nutrients are readily available, including gap and water resources. In comparison with spring, we see that a spring fire exposes seed banks to immediate problems associated with temperature declines and exposes them to a long period of summer or autumn conditions that degrade or erode the seed bank quality. So when the subsequent winter arises in 18 months or in 10 months' time, there's a significant reduction in seed bank quality, for lack of a better word. So to bring it back towards the theme, the losers here is broadly the recruitment mechanism loses when you change fire season, and the resprouting mechanism overwhelmingly wins. That's me. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Ryan. I got a lot of questions for you. I'll save them. Also, the Q&A is not working, so if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we will run through them at the end of the session. We're going to have a little bit of a change up now. Mercedes Ondik is going to be presenting next. Now, Mercedes is going to be giving us a little bit of a case study from what has happened on Kangaroo Island. She's actually in the US at the moment, so probably is pretty tired. So it's always good to have her on early so that she can get to bed. Thanks very much, Mercedes.
Thank you. And looking forward to presenting today. And so thanks to Joe as well for hosting us. So as Sean already said, my name is Mercedes Ondik, and I'm actually in the last year of my PhD at the University of New South Wales, and Dr. Mark Ooi, who presented first, is one of my two supervisors, as well as Dr. Miriam Munoz-Rojas. Before I get into my talk, I want to acknowledge the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which UNSW was built, and also the Aboriginal tribes that might once have inhabited Kangaroo Island in South Australia, where a lot of my work was done. I also pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today I'm going to talk about soils and how they are so important for supporting all of the plants that all of the other experts are going to teach you about today, and how potentially involving land owners, land caretakers, who privately manage our lands can actually help monitor our soils. So first, I want to impart on you the importance of our soils, which are the reservoirs of carbon and nutrients and water. They actually store more carbon than the atmosphere and above ground biomass combined, and about 2/3 of all fresh water on Earth. They feed the vegetation at the bottom of the food chain, and then they also house all of the decomposers at the end of the food chain, like earthworms and fungi. And in turn, they're able to provide amazing ecosystem services, both to the ecosystems that they are in part of and located in, but also to us as humans. And so you can see here on my slide, these include climate disaster mitigation by storing carbon, food and habitat, and clean water and air by actually filtering our water, and recycling matter. If we didn't have these recyclers, we would have a big buildup of things that wouldn't necessarily be decaying, which is not a good thing. I think for our perspective as human beings, we want space. So my first part of my project, I have two components that I'm going to be discussing today, was done here in Kangaroo Island after about half of the island was burned during the 2019-20 bushfire season. And so this is just a severity map, fire severity map of that mega fire, you can call it. And here you can see the location of my study in Northwest Kangaroo Island. We had two primary treatments that I'm going to be discussing today: burnt and unburnt dry sclerophyll woodland. And you can see that this was a higher severity fire that consumed the canopy. But we also had a burnt adjacent pasture land treatment, the results of which are available in the two publications that came out of this work listed on the bottom. Today, I'm not going to be spending too much time on that. I want to focus on our dry sclerophyll woodland. So 6 months after the fire occurred, we measured topsoil properties in the top 5 centimeters. And here are our results. I'll go through them one at a time. The first 3 are quite typical of a fire. So we observed an increase in pH, which comes from the deposition of ash and all of the different components in the ash, which are typically basic, and then a reduction in soil water repellency. And so this is a very interesting soil property, but in dry sclerophyll woodland in particular, where there are a lot of eucalypts that produce waxes such as terpenes, fire is able to reduce water repellency because, as you can see on the left, the unburned dry sclerophyll woodland is actually quite highly repellent. So we would set a droplet of water on top of these soils, and it would just stay there for minutes at a time without penetrating these soils at all. But then the burnt condition would take in that water within a few seconds. And so this potentially could help with post-fire germination or emergence of seedlings, that kind of thing. So potentially playing a role for, our pyrodiversity, giving a niche to different vegetation after fire. And then we saw a decrease in soil respiration, which is the amount of carbon dioxide released from the soil over time. And so fire kills things in the topsoil, including the soil microbes that are breaking down materials and things like that. Now, the next observation is quite drastic. It's a reduction in all of our measured soil nutrients, which is not necessarily typical of a fire and is indicative of the high severity of this fire that went through. A crown fire is able to consume all of the above ground biomass. So instead of a lower severity fire that might actually incorporate new nutrients into the soil like charcoal, we did not see that with this fire. The wildfire also significantly impacted the composition of soil microbial communities and the distribution of functions across these communities. And so here I'm showing a lot, but one important finding I can really zone in on is the ectomycorrhizal fungi in orange and blue. You can see in the burnt eucalypt forest, these fungi were greatly decreased due to the fire. And so ectomycorrhizal fungi cooperate with vegetation, providing their host with nutrients and water in exchange for carbon. Many orchid species actually depend on ectomycorrhizal fungi for their survival. And orchid species, there are many that are threatened and are also prevalent on Kangaroo Island. So the reduction in ectomycorrhizal fungi after this fire could have negative consequences for these individuals. The next part of my project was kind of very different, but gave some really important insights into my work. And this was a collaboration with Hotspots Fire Project, run by the New South Wales Nature Conservation Council and Rural Fire Service. And we did survey and interview work. So we were able to survey 37 New South Wales residents and interview 9 of them to better understand public observations, perceptions, and behaviors regarding the Black Summer. And you can see here on the right, the locations of individuals directly impacted by the Black Summer bushfires. They were spread out across the fire-affected region of New South Wales, as shown in light pink, and experienced a range of different fire severities. So some really insightful observations were made by these individuals that guided some of my PhD work. So here are a few key quotes from the interviews. It was open country, but Mercedes, it was burning the roots of plants underground. And when you were actually concentrating on fire, a little blue gas would appear behind you and be burning. It was quite frightening. I said to my colleague, Margaret, and we're standing there defending a vehicle, it's not going to burn, it's a rainforest, and it burned down in front of us. So these quotes really stuck with me after my interviews and just showed me what people were dealing with on the ground and how these fires were affecting both soils and our ecosystems, particularly those that are not fire adapted, like rainforests. And so from this, I also I asked different questions about behaviors and found that the 2019-20 fire season motivated most New South Wales residents that I interviewed into action. And so here are a few of the actions that they reported increasing their participation in, including participating in the Hotspots Fire Management Workshop, which is a workshop, as I discussed before, which is run by the Rural Fire Service and Nature Conservation Council to train about fire ecology and how fire interacts with our ecosystems in New South Wales. They also increased community involvement, sought out information on fire, modified their fire management plan, and participated in post-fire recovery. And these are the percentages by which these people increased their participation after the fire season, showing how the fire season was motivating behaviors. So given that more than 2/3 of New South Wales land area is actually privately managed by land caretakers, so not including land managers and fire and soil monitoring is actually a missed opportunity. And so I want to point out this potential of, collaborating with private managers. My research also showed that the Black Summer persuaded nearly 1/3 of survey participants that fire impacts on soil function are negative. And this perception is backed up by observations that there was increased erosion and also potentially a decrease in the number of soil animal types after the 2019-20 fires, both of which indicate reduced soil function. Now, the next thing I want to point out is that despite the fact that pH and soil nutrient levels are vulnerable to fires, as shown by my other work, especially high severity fires, very little was known about these soil properties by land managers. So nutrient levels are quite complex to measure and take time and money, but pH and a list of other soil quality indicators are actually quite easy and affordable to measure. And so that leads me to a soil health card. This is the soil health card that's been made for the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. And it provides a list of soil quality indicators and descriptions to identify the condition of each of these soil quality indicators. And so this is one example, providing soil health cards to allow land managers to quickly and affordably assess soil quality is one way we can involve land managers in soil monitoring, particularly because such a large, 70% of New South Wales is managed privately. So just wrapping up what I said already and driving it home, soils are really important as the foundation of ecosystems, but with climate change and high severity wildfires becoming more prevalent and widespread, there are concerns about soil health, and this can have knock-on effects for our ecosystems and also humans as well. So land managers of New South Wales were unaware of how 2019-20 fires impacted important soil properties, but this knowledge gap is also reflected in the literature. So by potentially collaborating with New South Wales residents to monitor soils before and after fire, we could improve knowledge of fire impacts on soils and the condition of soil health across New South Wales to better prepare for and respond to wildfires in the future. I'd like to thank everybody who made this work possible, and thank you all for sharing or for listening.
Thanks, Mercedes, and thanks for joining us from the States
thanks
today.
For having me.
Unfortunately, Sean hasn't been able to join us today, but we are actually running bang on time now, so that's perfect. We're just going to have roughly 10 minutes of question time. If you have any questions for any of the presenters, pop them in the chat. Joe's going to be running the questions, so you don't get sick of just my voice. And then after questions, we'll kick off again with our next session. Joe.
Thanks, Sean. There's one question here at the moment from Matt. Something about fire can also increase soil hydrophobicity. No, I'm not sure who would be best at answering that.
That was me.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the really complicated beauty of saltwater repellency that I was trying to bring out. So in dry sclerophyll woodland, we see a decrease in hydrophobicity, but in other ecosystems with different compositions of carbon coming from the different types of vegetation, you're going to have different baseline hydrophobicity and different responses to fire, because fire will transform those carbon compositions in different ways depending on what your starting material is. And so yes, absolutely, fire can increase or decrease hydrophobicity at different levels in the soil. And yes, so that it's quite a complex field.
Thanks for that, Mercedes. Another question. It's a general question. What advice have you provided or would you provide to land managers about considering severity and season? Who'd like to have it go at that one?
Mark, myself, or Tony.
Ryan?
I'll jump on first, and Mark and Tony can tell me when I'm wrong. So I think the interaction is really interesting between fire season and fire severity. There's particularly in WA, there's been a long-held belief that spring fires are generally lower severity, and we just got to balance that idea. So in my case, it turned out that autumn fires were lower severity for the most part. That doesn't mean that there was absent of high severity bits. So I think what Mark and Tony have demonstrated is that there is a benefit to high severity fires in some cases. So it's just more about building in a mixture of mosaics, be severity mosaics and also seasonal mosaics at a broader temporal scale.
Great. Thanks for that, Ryan. And here's another one that might be for you too, or anyone else. Are there concerns where curating particular areas through hazard reduction burning at particular temperatures?
So yeah, I guess in WA we undertake a lot of prescribed burning. I think I've said it a few times, that maybe not here, but elsewhere, that the Western Australian government undertakes the largest fire management jurisdiction in the world. Most of that is through prescribed burning. And I think the balance of mixtures of severity types aids in maintaining a mosaic of a diversity of plant responses. I think in the absence of extreme high severity fires, which we know can degrade small cedar species, for example, the benefits probably of of a small patch of high severity is quite beneficial to some plant species in particular. But again, it's a balance and a mixture, and working towards a suitable mixture, agreed upon mixture of those mosaics. It's complicated.
Can I just pop in very quickly as well? One of the things I sort of alluding to that first question about any advice to land managers, one of the things is after the fires that we've seen in 2019-20, where there's been extreme fire severity across a broad area, one thing is to consider allowing greater time for recovery before any more burns go into those systems. Because what we do know is, there's going to definitely be a lot of species that are okay, but they just need some more time to recover. They're slower to germinate, slower to do a whole lot of things. And so just giving that flexibility around the intervals that those systems may have, when you consider both severity and season for that matter, you need to just give these things some time to recover and incorporate that into your management plans, ideally.
Thanks, both. We've got quite a few questions here, which is great. The next one is from Paul. Hi, Paul. Tony, I presumed overgrazing of seedlings without unformed lignotubers post-fire will also be an important issue affecting them and for management.
Yeah, I mean, grazing affects everything post-fire, seedlings of obligate seeders, resprouters, and resprouting branches and stems. So, yeah, I mean, things like deer and horses, a couple of classic examples, and goats have problems for recovery after fire. So that's where sometimes immediate actions like fencing and that are required for localised populations to just kind of give them the time, as Mark suggested then, to recover. So yeah, I agree. That's right.
Okay, how are we going for time, Sean? Let's see, I've still got a few minutes. So on to the next question. This is from Chris. To anyone, I'd say, is that soil structure classification widely known or available? Would have been useful when I was pitfall trapping in burnt and unburnt areas. Who'd like to answer that one? Mercedes?
By soil structure classification, I'm assuming they mean like the soil quality indicator soil card. Is that, do I go? I can answer in that context. This soil card is available online. I can share the link in the chat. Essentially, the idea is it might be slightly different when you say like good versus bad. This is very dependent on ecosystem type, the different types of vegetation that are present, etc. But is fairly standard, I would say, for I don't know, maybe I shouldn't generalize, but you can definitely get an idea for the properties of your soil, and that can only be a good, especially if you have now a fire come through and you can monitor how that's going to impact your soils. But yeah, I hope that that's what you're referring to, Chris, but I'll drop it in the chat if that's helpful.
Thanks. And here's another one for you while you're still there. Mercedes,
yep.
Can you comment on the soil litter interface and how that can affect soil properties?
Okay, so there's one good example that I can comment on, but I'm not extremely familiar. But one thing that I found very interesting when studying fires was if you have a fire that chars the canopy but does not consume the canopy, once the leaves fall off of those trees, they're actually quite dense in carbon and nitrogen. And so when that litter is then in contact with the soil, it can help replenish the nutrients after a fire burns the soil and volatilizes nutrients into the air and atmosphere. And so That's one example of that interface, but another example is ash and how ash actually incorporates into the soil and interacts with soil water repellency. I would say it's a very complex question. You're going to get patches of water repellency dependent on the vegetation and where the roots are, and you'll get different pockets of different nutrient levels and things depending on different vegetation and their needs, for sure. But I hope that gives some answer to that big question.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one or two more. So one for Tony from Sean. In your assessment of priority species, have you looked at the role of within species variation in trait values?
The simple answer is no, Sean, but you could do it, and you could look at a species as different populations which have different traits. For instance, the common example is some populations of a species may be able to resprout, but others can't. So you have that fundamental difference in a trait. But that particular assessment, for instance, Rachel Gallia looked at 26,000 species nationally, so we really couldn't go to that level of detail for those things. So, but it's something that's possible.
Thanks, Tony. And one more probably, sorry everyone. And this is for you again, Mercedes. Are you aware of any research by the NCC about people's interest in climate action and reducing their carbon usage for climate action following the 1920 fires?
I wish I was. And if anybody finds any, you should share it. Yeah, I know that's from Annabelle. I'm sorry, yeah. I wish I knew more for you, but might be able to find, if you just look it up, hopefully, if there is something, they should have it quite available, but maybe I can even do a little search myself.
All right. Thanks so much for answering those questions, and to the attendees for asking lots of great questions, and there's still more there. So yeah, feel free to provide some more answers in the chat during the day.
Yes, please. If any of... Sorry, Joe. I was just going to say, I think there's a couple of really good questions. It'd be nice if the presenters could just answer those in the chat.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And also we have Belinda Kenny from NCC joining later on today. So she might be, Annabelle, you might want to ask her again later on. Okay, we're going to move on to the next session now. So thank you very much for everyone for joining session 1. Give us a couple of minutes while we roll presenters.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So we're going to pop on Jenny Guerin's presentation. So Jenny is from Kangaroo Island. She's from the South Australian Sea Conservation Centre, and it's actually going to be taking us on a tour of Kangaroo Island and explaining some of the actions that they took in response to the fires. Collection, conservation, and also some translocation and restoration has already occurred. Because of a poor connection down there, Jenny actually has pre-recorded her presentation. Richie's going to pop it on now, but she is online, as you can see, and she's going to be able to answer your questions. So please don't hesitate to put questions in. Richie, I will leave it to you to pop on Jenny's talk.
Kangaroo Island has over 900 native plant species. A number of these are endemic to the island, and there are a number of niche habitats on the island. There are over 200 threatened species, and it's considered that there are many species that are better conserved on the island than they are in mainland Australia. In the bushfires of late 2019 and early 2020, fires went for several days and burned through over 200,000 hectares, mainly on the west end of the island in the National Park and Wilderness area. This is a photo about 8 months post-fire. You can see that things are fairly scorched, with just the green of the xanthorrhoea starting to spread back. Activities of the South Australian Seed Conservation Centre staff and volunteers are going to be outlined in this talk. There were over 20 field trips to the island since the fire, and we conducted surveys, a bit of population and mappings, rapid fire assessments of priority species, and we collected specimens and made seed collections where possible. And using those seeds, we developed germination protocols for future recovery work. We also fed a lot of this information through back to local partners and fire management.
Is it working to get,
as an example of,
have you tried baking them?
the fire intensity seemed to differ in different areas on the island. These two photos are from swamps in Miss Chase National Park, where one has regenerated well with a number of species springing back. These are taken probably 10 months since the fire, but in other areas we found it was just charred ash. This is probably due to looking back at the fire histories of the area. That the swamp that was very charred had more previous fires in its history, and also very low soil moisture index was indicated. Sometimes a combination of events leads to higher fire intensities. So all up, over 500 scientific specimens were collected since the fire, and it includes the species that had not been recorded on the island before, and also some not recorded in South Australia. One of these was Trithuria australis. We thought the only Trithuria we had in the state was Trithuria submersa, the red Trithuria, but this little white one was found near Larrikinda Lagoon. We were able to collect seeds and bait from both species, and also with some help from Western Australian botanists, we were able to give a name to this species, which is also rare in Western Australia. We managed to track down several historical collections that we'd actually been searching the island for years. One of these was Kenmorrisonii morosum. This was only known as a single historic record in the state from Kangaroo Island in the 1950s. But post-fire, we located two large populations and banked over 500,000 seeds. It was found to be an obligate reseeder and a very short-lived fire ephemeral. Another was the Nymphoides geminata, which we had been searching for many years, and two new locations for this were located. It hadn't really been, it was last recorded in the 1960s. We found with this species it was really important to be searching at the right time when the flowers were just emerging. 225 seed collections were made for 122 species of plants from Kangaroo Island, and these include many threatened species. One of these was the black-beaked duck orchid, Callistemon disjuncta. There were historic records from the 60s, two of them on the island, but nobody we spoke to on the island had ever seen it. However, collectively post-fire, we found 5 new populations. So it seems this species was was better conserved than we thought on the island. On the mainland, we only know population, and it's also very threatened in Victoria. We banked seeds for this. We isolated fungus that germinated the seeds, and these are now banked for perpetuity. Another example is the Demol River Coria. This only occurs in Demol River at the north of the island, and we found this to be an obligate reseeder. The fire had destroyed all of the adult plants and only the seedlings remained, but the recruitment seemed quite successful, so we weren't that worried initially. This series of photos, what happened showed what happened post-fire. There is the fire that destroyed the animal. But after that came a flood event in early 2022, and it actually scoured out all of the young seedlings that had been recruiting on the riverbanks. At this stage, we decided to intervene. We had propagated plants, which we were able to translocate back to site. So over 100 new correas have been planted, and after the first year, we found a survivorship rate of over 75%. We also developed a website about the flora of Kangaroo Island. We're able to upload a lot of the fire response data and germination data and seed collection data onto the site. And it's really available to everybody, particularly people on the island and visitors to the island. And it's very useful to be used as a field guide with lots of images and information about plants. We conducted threatened flora workshops and also a number of small translocations on the island. Over 15 species of threatened plants were translocated. We also, in partnership with BioWire and the Native Conservation Society of South Australia, started a seed production garden. This was on land at Cygnet Park Sanctuary that was donated by BioWire, and we constructed a exclosure 100 by 50 metres and did landscaping with some ironstone areas, some cowrie areas, some inundated areas to actually try and replicate the ecosystems on the island, and also provide somewhere to plant these plants. So we've now planted over 3,000 plants for over 80 threatened species in there. And this is actually, we've now been able to attract a friends group to come and help manage the area. We've attracted further grant funding. It is to become an area of education and to introduce people to the beautiful flora of Kangaroo Island, but more importantly, it's to provide seed and tropical material for restoration of other areas on the island. And finally, I'd like to thank all the partners that were involved in this work. The Seed Centre's worked with a number of institutions and funding bodies, and also thanks to donations that were raised through the Botanic Gardens Foundation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny. That was a recording, but as I said, Jenny is online, so you can ask her questions. I also popped a link in the chat for that field guide that they developed. It's a really handy resource. I've looked at it too. It's quite fun. Great. So I'll just give Mark a little intro while he gets set up. So Mark is completing a PhD at La Trobe University, where the team is looking at how genomics can be used to restore resilience into East Gippsland's threatened flora following the 1920 fires. Mark's going to be working on a case study species, Callistemon kenmorrisonii. I hope I got that right. Thanks, Mark.
That's correct, yeah. All right, thanks, Chantel. So hi, everyone. So today, as Chantel said, I'll be presenting some work we've been doing on the East Gippsland endemic Callistemon kenmorrisonii, and we've been doing that in conjunction with our partners, Envite Environment. Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land the research was carried out on, the Gunai Kurnai, the Bidaiwal, and the Wurundjeri. Right, so the impetus of this study was the Black Summer fires, and with an outlook on future management strategies, the project focused on obtaining genomic information and post-fire recovery status of several fire-affected narrow endemic plant species from East Gippsland. But as I said earlier, I'll be focusing on Callistemon kenmorrisonii. And the results of this study are being used to inform land managers and local community groups in establishing ex situ insurance populations, whilst also providing information for in situ conservation strategies. So just briefly introducing the species, Callistemon kenmorrisonii, or the Betka bottlebrush. It's endemic to the Betka River in the Wingham State Forest near Genoa in Victoria, where it grows on riparian granite rock bars. It's only known from 2 small wild populations, which have about 90 individuals between them. And both populations were severely burnt during the fires. Callistemon kenmorrisonii is listed as vulnerable federally, but in Victoria it's listed as critically endangered. And based on morphology, this taxa is also disputed as a possible hybrid of more common species, Callistemon citrinus and Callistemon subulatus. So first, I just want to talk about the genomic study, and then we'll move on to how the species are recovering post-black summer fires. So the aims of the genomic research were threefold. So we wanted to determine whether clonality was evident within the populations. We also wanted to assess genotypic diversity. And we wanted to assess taxonomic identification, especially in regards to evidence that might support the taxon having a hybrid origin. In terms of sampling, all wild Callistemon kenmorrisonii individuals are sampled, along with some nursery stock cultivated by the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria. There are also some collections of the putative parental species, Callistemon citrinus and Callistemon subulatus. So I sent the samples away to diversity array technologies for sequencing of SNPs, and I subsequently filtered these in R to produce high quality SNPs for downstream analysis. So in terms of clonality, we used two different approaches, both performed in R. Firstly, a maximum likelihood of pairwise distance genetic distance approach, and a maximum likelihood of co-ancestry approach as well. And very surprisingly, we observed very high levels of clonality in this taxon. So if we look at our first wild population, Ken A, we only observed 5 multi-locus genotypes, or MLGs, out of 37 samples. So if we look at this genet map here, we can see each color represents a different genotype in the population, and each point represents a sample and its coordinates within the population. We can see here that we have this very large genet, which comprised 32 of the 37 stems sampled, and it all shared the same genotype. And that was about 187 square meters, that genet. So we look at the second population, Chem B, that was found to be monoclonal. So only one genotype out of 46 samples, and that covered an area of about 1,525 square meters. So I also wanted to note here that we had 2 nursery-grown populations that were germinated from seed from the Kangaroo site, and these plants all shared the same genotype, except one plant, and that genotype was found within the Kangaroo population also. In terms of hybridization, we used 3 different approaches which provided strong evidence that supported previous morphological assumptions that Callistemon kenmorrisonii has a hybrid origin involving Callistemon citrinus and Callistemon subulatus. So just one example, if we look at this structure output here, and structure is a program that allocates samples that share similar patterns of genomic variation into clusters. So you can see here this orange cluster was formed by the citrinus samples. We also have the subulatus A samples which formed their own cluster, likewise with the subulatus B cluster here, the purple one. But if we look at the kenmorrisonii MLGs, you can see that they did not form their own cluster, but have an admixture of the citrinus and subulatus clusters. And this was a strong indication that Callistemon kenmorrisonii had a hybrid origin. So in summary, we found high levels of clonality and very low genotypic diversity, and the occurrence of very large genets in our wild population. We also had seed propagated plants that all shared the same genotype as the plants the seed was collected from. So what's going on in terms of reproduction in this taxa? Our current hypothesis is that it's reproducing asexually via vegetative suckering and also via apomixis. So apomixis is basically a type of asexual reproduction that produces seed without sex. So seed develops without meiosis to produce maternal clonal offspring. And apomixis has been observed in other Callistemons, and I'm currently working on this hypothesis as part of my PhD. So in regard to the extremely low genotypic diversity we found, the original on-ground population estimates, which were based on stem counts, may need to be amended, where counts based on genotype would be probably better suited to this taxon. And taxonomically, there may be a need to recognise Callistemon kenmorrisonii's hybrid origin, though further studies assessing phenotypic stability, ploidy levels, reproductive isolation, and apomixis should be undertaken before this happens. And this will give us a better idea to see whether hybrid speciation may have occurred in this taxon. All right, so moving on to the recovery of the taxon, I'd just like to acknowledge Bryce Watts-Parker from Envite Environment, who's done pretty much all of the post-Black Summer fire monitoring for this taxon. So I first just wanted to walk through some timeline images to show you what was kind of happening with the species. So this is about 6 months after the fire. We can see that the population was completely decimated, but we're starting to get this basal vegetative resprouting starting to appear. Next, we jump to about a year and a half later, and we can see the population's recovered very well. So November to January 2021 was the first flowering season after the fires, and a lot of inflorescences were observed, which subsequently produced a lot of seed capsules. Again, skipping forward another year, and we can see that the plants are holding seed from the 2021-22 flowering season, and we also have seed from the next flowering season further up the stem. Looking at the second image, we can see how much post-fire growth we have compared to the old burnout stems and the size of the plant before the fires. So prior to the fires, we had about 90 individuals. Our surveys, we counted 87 individuals, but as I said earlier, this was all vegetative regrowth with only 6 genotypes between them. And we've observed no seed recruitment as yet. And this is most likely due to 2 reasons. The first, that the fires probably burnt so hot that the seed was destroyed. And the second being the somewhat long period of time that it takes for the seed to mature and disperse from the plant. We do know the seed is viable. We've grown a lot of plants from 20 or so seed capsules. So hopefully in the next year or 2, we might start seeing some seedling recruitment. So there's still ongoing stochastic threats that Callistemon kenmorrisonii faces. So firstly, the riparian zone that occupies is extremely flood prone. And despite seeming quite well adapted to this disturbance, we're seeing adverse effects where large wood debris from the fires are washing down into the populations and crushing plants of unique genotype and blocking light from new vegetative growth growing through. There's also sand and rock debris coming in from nearby bridge works, which is being washed into the population and smothering plants. But we've met with DECA and currently work is planned to remove this debris. So finally, I just want to talk about the work that we're doing in relation to ex situ insurance of Callistemon kenmorrisonii. So despite the fact that diverse insurance populations are not really possible, there's still value in having collections that include all the genotypes we do have. So as part of my PhD, I've collected and catalogued all of the available seed from all the known genotypes, and we currently have hundreds of plants growing at La Trobe, which will act as an insurance population after my project is finished. We also have collections at the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, Muggi Nursery in Orbost, and with Friends of Malakuta, which is a community group in Malakuta. And I'd just like to acknowledge a few people. So Alison and Mandy Diombrain from La Trobe University, Envine Environmental, Muggi Nursery and Friends of Malakuta, and La Trobe and DECA for funding for the project. Thank you.
Mark, that was really fascinating. I think there's going to be a few questions. We're going to jump to Linda now. Linda, I will just remind you, is a soil scientist from New South Wales Soil and Land Assessment and is going to be talking about impacts of burning on the Warrumbungles. Thanks, Linda.
The work I'm presenting on today is been undertaken mainly by a lot of different members of our soils team from Department of Planning and Environment. So these images basically show what happened after 2013 wildfires in Warrumbungles National Park area. 56,000 hectares was burnt, and about 70% of that was at either a high or severe level. And that resulted in extensive erosion from slopes at an average of about 25 tonnes per hectare. And that material, as you can see, was deposited in drainage lines and occurred as either debris flows moving through the catchment or generally as bed load moved through these drainage lines. And the image on the left shows you even 2 years after the fires, there was still erosion in drainage lines, and that started to stabilise some 2 years after the fire event itself. And I guess I'm showing this because it is a real risk to plant establishment, particularly plants on lower slopes, plants in drainage lines, smothering by material. And I note that Mark's presentation showed that as well. from the slopes is definitely a very real risk. We looked at total organic carbon levels following the fire. So we looked at the carbon that was in different soil types. So there were soils developed on both sandstone and trachyte in the national park. And the trachyte soils had higher initial organic carbon levels than the sandstone soils. But you might notice there that the trachyte soils actually lost a substantially larger amount of organic carbon. So they're more highly fertile soils, and it's likely that they'll take longer to recover than the sandstone soils. Total nitrogen levels followed a similar trajectory to the total carbon levels in topsoils. So as fire severity increased, nitrogen levels declined almost linearly, and that's in the topsoil. And that's probably not surprising because most of your nitrogen is probably in topsoil, and it's lost at quite low temperatures due to volatilization. We looked also at soil respiration and for the two soil types, and it's quite interesting. What we found was that respiration was affected at fairly low fire severities on sandstone soil types compared to the soils developed on trachytes, and it's quite likely that that's because of the thermal conductivity and the differences in thermal conductivity between those two soils. So the dermasols developed on trachytes have a lower thermal conductivity due to the mineral nature of the mineral components of the soils. And that's reflected, I think, here in a reduction in the effect on the soil microbial community. There also could be some elements around the high aggregation of the dermasols developed on trachytes, which may perhaps have protected the microbial community. We were fortunate enough to have a student working on soil sampling in Kosciuszko National Park prior to the 2019-20 fires, and she was able to then go back and resample after the fires. So that this is pilot lookout here, and there was certainly a substantial amount of carbon lost. But one of the important things, and you might be able to see in the graph there, is that as carbon levels increased pre-fire, we also see larger losses of carbon post-fire. So our higher carbon soils are the ones that are most highly affected, and this, of course, is a big issue, particularly in Kosciuszko National Park, where we have high carbon soils such as alpine humus soils, and they contain a lot of our important threatened plant communities, and they're most likely to be more highly affected and lose more carbon with wildfire. And I'd just like to end here with some images from the Port Macquarie peat fires, which were also ignited in 2019 fires. They actually burned underground for over 6 months and burnt metres of peat and resulted in a lot of environmental devastation. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Really good presentation. I've also got lots of questions on that one. We are going to jump to another pre-record now. And this one is by Paul Williams. Paul actually is doing field work right now, so he couldn't join us, but he's going to be talking about some monitoring that was going on before the 2019-2020 fires and including them in Southeast Queensland all the way up to Cairns and back again. Richie's going to pop on that presentation for us, and then after that we'll be back on program and Mark Graham will be talking about some of the impacts in northern New South Wales.
Hello. Thank you, Chantel and Mark, for inviting me to provide some observations about the Queensland flora recovery following the 2019-20 wildfires, which burned from about September 2019 through to January 2020. They burned heath, eucalypt forests, and some rainforests, although I will focus on the eucalypt forests this talk. There's two broad concepts that I'd like to present from our post-fire assessments. Firstly, eucalypt forests with a history of being burnt regularly, more resilient to wildfires than adjacent forests that have been rarely burnt before wildfire. Secondly, Follow-up burns within a few years of high-intensity wildfires can be beneficial to thin excessive wattle and other sapling densities and maintain a healthy grass and herb layer. The locations discussed in this talk are in eucalypt forests and woodlands of southeast Queensland, namely Mount Lindsay on the New South Wales-Queensland border, Main Range National Park, and some bushland reserves in Brisbane. Also in northeast Queensland, in Bush Heritage Australia's Yorker Reserve, west of Cairns, and a little bit further north, grazing land, where there's an interesting rare wattle acacia purpura and pedala. In September 2020, nearly a year after the 2019 wildfires burned through eucalypt forests on the Queensland-New South Wales border, Dave Kington, Penny Watson, Eleanor Collins and I surveyed the post-fire vegetation condition in several locations, Mount Lindsay and Main Range National Park. We wanted to see whether forests with a history of regular burning was more resilient to the wildfires than adjacent forests that have been rarely burnt prior to the wildfires. We visited areas that Dave and Penny had a history of observing, where they had noted that forests that had been burnt regularly were always looking more healthy. We found regularly burnt forests had almost no canopy damage after the 2019 wildfires and maintained a healthy grass layer. They also had only moderate recruitment of wattles and other saplings. In contrast, rarely burnt eucalypt forests had considerable canopy depth, a poor grass layer, but that was true even before the wildfire, and excessive wattle and other sapling recruitment. The reason we think excessive wattle recruitment is a problem is because it can smother the diverse grass layer, excessive nitrogen can contribute to canopy dieback, and dense saplings produce a high elevated fuel load that provides a ladder for flames to burn into the canopy in the next fire. Areas of Main Range where the ranges are burned regularly also look better after the wildfire. And again, adjacent, rarely burnt eucalypt forest had very dense wattle recruitment after the wildfire. The flora that benefited from regular burning are many grasses, especially kangaroo grass, and palm, and native sorghums, sagas, as well as many native herbs. These are plants and ecosystems that small mammals and birds such as northern bettong, eastern bristlebird, and Gouldian finches rely upon. The trees also benefit from regular burning to protect them from high-intensity wildfires. Plants that benefit from occasional high-intensity wildfires are many wattles such as Acacia iorata, Alocasuarina littoralis, some native vines such as Canedia rubicunda, and quite a few rainforest trees and shrubs such as Polycys elegans, tremor, and stinging trees. Looking at bushland around Brisbane now, this is a transect, one of many that we've been surveying since 2019. This is in Scribbly Gum Forest. This is how it looked when we first established the transect. This is how it looked 3 years after the council implemented a low-intensity planned burn. The burn was in 2013. It didn't change the structure. It just had small recruitment, small densities of shrubs such as wattles. This site was burnt in the December 2019 wildfire. This is in 4 months after that wildfire. A year after the wildfire, you can see that the many wattles, almost 1,000 wattles in 100 square metres, acacia concurrents, plus hundreds of Alocasuarina littoralis and Alphatonia excelsa, are starting to become apparent a year after fire, and a second year after fire. And by 3 years after the wildfire, the elevated fuel load is very high, and these shrubs or saplings are competing with the grassland. Brisbane City Council implemented a low-intensity follow-up burn in May this year. That's 3.5 years after the wildfire. We hope that this has thinned some of the excessive Acacia concurrens and Casuarina littoralis saplings, and allows for grasses and herbs to regenerate and maintain their abundance. Moving to North Queensland, December, this is Bush Heritage Australia's Yorker Reserve west of Cairns. Part of it burnt intensely in the 2019 wildfire, and this wildfire promoted massive germination of many wattles and other legumes. For the last decade, Murray Hassler from Bush Heritage and I have been monitoring the vegetation structure in relation to fires at Yorker. We survey consecutive hectares along multiple 1 kilometre long traverses, document broad vegetation patterns and fire behaviour. Reflecting the message from southeast Queensland, fire scorch height was higher in the woodland that had only been burnt once in the decade prior to the 2019 wildfire, compared to adjacent forests burnt twice prior to the wildfire. The forest burnt twice prior to the wildfire burnt more patchily, and this allowed the fire-sensitive Callitris intratropica to survive quite happily. In contrast, the area burnt only once prior to the wildfire had 100% complete ground layer burning, and this corresponded with areas of greater wattle and other seedling density. Paul Hales, the Yorker Reserve Manager, has subsequently implemented many really successful follow-up burns after 2019. This has resulted in fingers of fire breaking up fuel loads and reducing the overall density of some of the overabundant wattles. You can see that it's only burning parts of the population and many plants still remain. So it doesn't take out entire populations of seedlings and obligacetas. Of note, many obligaceta shrubs across Queensland mature and begin setting flower and seed in 2 to 3 years, occasionally 4 years after fire. Davesia philippes is another obligaceta small shrub that is maintained in a healthy population with regular patchy burning. Even a rainforest tree kangaroo travelled over a kilometre to inspect Paul's plant burned areas. I'll finish off with an interesting rare plant. This is Acacia purpuropetala. It has a critically endangered federal listing and vulnerable Queensland status. It grows in tropical woodlands that are burnt regularly. It recovered well after the 2019 wildfire. It's an obligaceta, and these plants were maturing and flowering in under 2 years after fire. This species thrives in a patchily burnt landscape with regular fire. In conclusion, our observations suggest that regular burning of subtropical and tropical eucalypt forests keeps them healthy and resilient to wildfires. Where wildfires have promoted excessive sapling recruitment, a follow-up fire within a few years can help reduce their density. And these follow-up burns are patchy, and they allow the survival of a high percentage of obligaceta plants that maintain their populations from the regularly burnt patchy landscape. I'm sorry that I'm away in the field while this symposium is on. I can be contacted at this email for further discussion. Thanks very much for your time.
That was Paul. Yes, you can email him. His email was there if you have any questions, or you can send them in the chat and we'll pass them on. Next, we are going to stay in the rainforest. Mark Graham, who's a consultant with the Bellingen Nature Company, is going to be taking us on a personal tour of an area that he's got great passion for. Mark, you can get yourself ready while I'm giving a little spiel here. He's going to be taking us on a tour of the Gondwana rainforest areas that were impacted by the fires. I think you might remember there were lots of concerns about what was going to happen in that area. So I'm really interested to see what you found.
Thank you, Sean. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Lovely to join you. I'm joining you from Gumbaynggirr country, halfway between Brisbane and Sydney. The work that I'm describing today occurred during and after the fires of Black Spring and Black Summer. The area that I'm covering is from the coastal lowlands of the Bellinger Valley lowland subtropical rainforest systems through to the cool temperate rainforests and subalpine systems atop the higher parts of the Dorrigo Plateau. The work that I've done has been mostly self-funded, although in the latter part I was funded from a New South Wales Government Bushfire Local Economic Recovery Fund grant. The very first mega fires of Black Spring occurred in this part of the world, with the Bee's Nest fire commencing almost 4 years ago. And that set off what was to be essentially the largest forest fires ever experienced by humanity. And I witnessed firsthand those fires and fought them, and then I've monitored them extensively since. My work, some of it has been quantitative and systematic, but most of it has been opportunistic and descriptive in terms of traversing landscapes and looking at post-fire condition and recovery, and being able to compare and contrast conditions post-fire to those that existed beforehand. I'm the custodian or the owner of a network of private conservation areas from the lowlands to the highlands. And because of that, I traverse this landscape very frequently. So my return intervals have been quite frequent in large parts of the landscape. The photographs here were areas of Nothofagus, cool temperate rainforests that burnt effectively in a crown fire. That area has been systematically sampled with Dr. Rob Koyman, because there were a number of areas of Nothofagus forests that burnt at this type of high intensity. And it's been very interesting to observe the responses of those systems. And I understand that Dr. Koyman and others will be publishing those results over time. There's some crown scorch in the cool temperate rainforest. This is an elevation of around about 1,300 meters. So my work traverses a gradient from around about 100 meters to around about 1,300 meters, one of the most significant elevation gradients on the continent, and probably the largest outside of the Alps. This is my initial study area from the west of the Bellinger Valley through to the high parts of the Dorrigo Plateau and across to the headwaters of the Macleay Valley. This is the GBAM fire intensity mapping that was undertaken by the state government. Initially, I was sampling that to look at the accuracy and the reliability of that. Certainly through the course of the work, it did become apparent that low intensity fires through rainforests were not being picked up by the mapping because they were obscured by closed canopy, but a lot of the high intensity areas certainly accorded with what was on the ground. A traverse from the lowlands right through the highest parts of the escarpment, the Great Escarpment, through to the headwaters of the Macleay River. Most of it's in Gumbaynggirr country, parts of it were in Dunghutti, a little bit of Anawan, and later on I'll talk about Yagle country. The Dorrigo Plateau itself is extensively cleared and was a major barrier to the movement of fire. I suspect that if there was forest canopy intact, that fires would have burnt right across that landscape. Areas that, in all honesty, were not supposed to burn did burn, and there was a great sense of amazement that some of these ancient moist refugial forests with outstanding universal values actually did burn. And thankfully, in the wash-up, the largest expanses of these globally significant forests actually didn't burn. There's definitely been major harm in terms of canopy reduction and ecosystem disruption, ecosystem collapse in places, but thankfully the large blocks of forest that constitute the Gondwana estate and private areas adjoining it mostly did not burn. And our mission going forward is to ensure that in future fire events and fire seasons, such as we might be on the cusp of, that we do whatever we can to keep fire out of these areas of great antiquity and outstanding universal value. This is my second area, which is on the northern and western Dorrigo Plateau. Undertook a fairly intensive sampling regime across a study area of about 40,000 hectares, funded by New South Wales Bushfire Local Economic Recovery Fund, around about 1,300 kilometres of road-based transect, around about 330 kilometres of foot-based transect, which enabled me a fairly comprehensive understanding of the post-fire recovery conditions of this landscape. The largest unburnt expanse of forest in this entire landscape was the Mount Highland Nature Reserve. That was because of a lot of incredibly hard work done by private citizens to protect that area. Other than that, most of the major expanses of forest in this landscape did experience fire. A lot of it was at a great intensity. Now, this area provides water security to the people on the coastal plain between Coffs Harbour or Sawtell and Yamba. Over 100,000 people derive their water supply from this landscape. Contains the most diverse tall eucalypt forests on Earth, globally unique assemblages, really important aquatic ecosystems, a host of endemic species, and recovery is quite patchy and in places practically non-existent. A lot of the moist ancient forests that exist in this landscape have had their canopy largely removed or entirely removed, and there's been extensive invasion by exotic species at the higher elevation, blackberry and exotic grasses at lower elevation, tobacco bush, privet, lantana, in areas that were previously entirely weed-free. In areas that experience quite high fire intensity as well, moist forest communities have regenerated or recruited with a lot of fire-promoting species such as wattles and daisies. So there's been a shift in state in a lot of these ecosystems. That's my study area. I'm about to release my final report upon this project. It's also looking at a blueprint for recovery, and basically the last thing that's needed is more fire in this entire landscape for the foreseeable future to allow and enable the survival, the persistence and the recovery of the globally significant biota that exists within it. There were some truly amazing rainforests that experienced major disruption. That's quite an old yellow carabine that burnt right through. That was a traverse of a landscape that we thought it was well and truly off track. We thought there may have been some unburnt refuges, but the entire basin had burnt. A lot of it actually wasn't mapped. This area in particular, on this particular image, had a fire through the understory, taking out an understory of walking stick palms, ferns, bryophytes and other very moist forest-dependent biota. Within that landscape too were populations of sphagnum frog, moist ancient forest-dependent fauna species that are no longer there. Upslope, there were significant areas of old-growth forests that sustained total canopy collapse. So species such as the greater glider and the yellow-bellied glider that had strongholds in that landscape and the glossy black cockatoo have sustained major population collapses and persist in very few areas when previously they had globally significant strongholds in that very landscape. So there's some big problems in these truly astonishing globally significant landscapes. And for species such as these, the best thing that we can do is to protect, restore and expand habitats to allow these large forest-dependent fauna species the chance to recover. Thankfully, they're not completely extirpated. There are residual or remnant populations of these species in these forests, and we've got to do whatever we can to hold those populations, recover and expand. So the losers, the outstanding universal values of the Gondwana estate have been significantly compromised in those areas that were fire impacted. Moist, dark, ancient refugial forests have been rendered very open, very dry, and very fire prone for the foreseeable future. Species such as the silver sword lily have actually lost population. That's a fascinating endemic species along the moist waterfall landscapes of the Dorrigo Plateau, southern flanks. Frogs have lost habitat and have become locally extinct. Hollow-dependent fauna have lost out. Water security and carbon stores have been mobilised. Exotic plants and weeds have benefited. It's likely that vertebrate pest species such as foxes and cats have boomed. Certain fire-promoting native species have boomed and fungi have enjoyed a real bonanza. Agencies which, like burning countries such as the Forestry Corporation, have benefited, and they're burning rainforests right now on the Dorrigo Plateau and these moist ancient refugial forests. It's quite a tragedy playing out in terms of the management of the public forest estate. So what do we need to do? For large parts of the landscape, no fire for the foreseeable future. Let it recover. We need to look more closely at the mapping of areas impacted by fire, particularly those areas that might have been missed with low intensity ground fires. And we basically need to invest in rapid fire suppression, working at the grassroots with community and remote firefighting capacity to urgently suppress fires when they ignite from lightning in remote bushland areas to prevent these types of future extreme events impacting the Gondwanan biota. More importantly, we've got to stop burning fossil fuels, stop clearing native vegetation, stop burning any of these moist ancient refugial landscapes. And the vision for our community now is to urgently restore the cloud forests and these Gondwanan systems in areas where they've been depleted or reduced or lost to fire and clearing, so that we can rebuild the moisture within these landscapes and ensure that these Gondwanan systems persist for the next 60, 80, 100 or 120 million years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I feel like I need to give you a rousing celebration there. As Mark said, it's important to keep things on the agenda and relevant and pertinent. Our final speakers are going to be Professor Jeremy Bruhl and Dr. Heidi Zimmer. They've been working together in your area as well, Mark, to survey specifically for epiphytic orchids. I know orchids are a big draw card for lots of botanists and plant enthusiasts, so there's going to be a lot of interest in this talk. Thank you very much, Jeremy and Heidi.
Thanks a lot, Chantal. I'm coming from Anawan country, and Heidi is miles away to the south. We wanted to talk about 4 Australian Cinderella orchids, or species of orchids. We call them Cinderellas because the epiphytic orchids and lithophytic orchids haven't received the same attention in terms of conservation biology, conservation studies as the terrestrials. So who are they, and are they okay? And will my mouse go on to the next slide? Thank you. Our aims were to compare the pre and post fire status of these 4 species, 3 of them epiphytic and 1 of them lithophytic. The sites are basically on northeastern New South Wales, on the northern tablelands and the north coast of New South Wales. A lot of the survey work we did was on the eastern fall of the escarpment. So in turn, the first one is this tiny, tiny little Adelapetalum agaropum. Each of those flowers is about half the size of my smallest fingernail. And this species is considered to grow more or less exclusively, perhaps exclusively, on Exocarpus capriciformis, the cherry ballard. We know of populations that were decimated, with most of the host plants killed outright and not even present. So the plants that had been seen before the fires are also gone. So lovely little orchid, and if you look at the distribution of it, it's perhaps considered widespread at the moment. But hold on, where's the anchor of the name? The type of this species is from Norfolk Island, yet this photo was taken on the escarpment in the northern tablelands of New South Wales. And the plants look morphologically distinct, especially to the likes of Heidi and Mark Clemens. So we've actually made a collection of this off a really healthy plant that Mark will be investigating further. And we've also collected leaf samples for DNA analysis. The next one is another tiny orchid, Plectorrhiza purpurata. It grows mostly on a tea tree, Leptospermum polygallifolium, but also on the divaricate shrub, Coprosma quadrifida. And the scene that you're looking at is typical of the sort of habitat of this species, which is drainage lines or creek lines on the northern tablelands. And what we're looking through here are large, old, established plants of Leptospermum polygallifolium that have been completely killed by the fire. But you can, I guess the good news coming up is that you can see plants in the mid-ground of this photo of plants that are regenerating. But in general, we didn't find plants of the orchid on those smaller tea trees. So the populations are mostly decimated. And here is a lovely photo of Plectyrrhiza purpurata. You can see it, of course, can't you? Well, if you look a bit closer, you'll see on one of the branches right in the middle of that last shot was this plant. And although this is post-fire flowering, here's a photo from Lachlan Copeland of a pre-fire plant in flower. So a lot of plants, a lot of sites are decimated by the fires, but some new sites with the small numbers of the orchids found. And in some cases, we were finding plants, this plant of Plectyrrhiza purpuratas on Coprosma, and you can see it's doing very well and fruiting handsomely. So of the four, this species, Psychocallis equalis, is a lithophyte. As you can see on this pre-fire photo, the plant is a largest clump, probably about the size of several hands width, growing directly on a rock outcrop in Oxley Wild Rivers National Park. Now, I went back to sites that Lachlan had surveyed pre-fire, and in some cases we found no evidence of Psychocallis. In other cases, as on the right, I found smaller numbers of plants and smaller plants. So the plant on the right is about less than a hand's width. And not in flower isn't a big deal because I was looking at a non-flowering time of the year for that species. And last we have Tropolis angusta. This is a member of the, if you like, the Dendrobium emulum complex. It grows perhaps exclusively on forest oak, Alicasuarina torullosa, and we found populations that have been damaged by fire, but also plants that we know well. One of my accomplices, citizen scientist Michelle Kolpis, had found plants that were at below eye level a year ago and not present this year. So they've been looted. This is another case of, this species is another case of question marks. Are all the plants on Alicasuarina torullosa and Tropolis angusta, does it occur on other plants? And so we were collecting samples to allow that study. Over to you, Heidi.
Thanks, Jeremy. So with all that wonderful data that Jeremy collected, I then set about undertaking an extinction risk assessment, and I did this using the common assessment method, which is the IUCN best practice method that most Australian jurisdictions have signed up to. So I assessed the species using criteria A through E for them falling into the categories such as critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. And these assessments are based on population size and species distribution and any evidence of decline. Next slide, please, Jeremy. So what did we find? As you can see, we have 4 potentially endangered species up there. So for the Adelipedilum arguorum, the population has obviously been reduced. It's very range restricted, meeting the criteria A and B for endangered. And we do have a taxonomic manuscript in preparation to define the continental Australian occurrences. For Plectrizia purpurata, it's also undergone significant population and range reductions. So that also meets criteria A and B for endangered, meets the thresholds there. For Sarcochilus aequalis, because of its population reductions and decline in range, it also meets the criteria for endangered. And for Tropolis angusta, if we go with it how our current understanding is, it would meet the criteria for endangered based on population reduction, but there is a few questions still to be answered about its taxonomy. So we'll be looking into a population genomics study to get that sorted out. Back to you, Jeremy.
So where next? Well, you can see that Heidi is well underway and that we'll be working towards finalising that report that will be a series of recommendations, which will go for review to the scientific committee. The leaf samples are going to the Australian Tropical Herbarium in Cairns for molecular analysis. That's of Adelipedilum arguorum and Tropolis angusta. And we'd like to thank a whole bunch of organisations, including our funding agencies, ANPC and the San Diego Zoo, who would have guessed, and permissions from national parks and from forestry, and help from a bunch of people. I want to single out Lachlan Copeland, who provided a lot of pre-fire information and advice during the survey work, guiding us on sites that we might check out. I want to introduce Michelle Colpus, a North Coast nurse, who is a great citizen scientist and bushwalker, and she took me to various new sites for one of the orchids. So thanks a lot, and any questions?
Thanks very much, Jeremy and Heidi. Well done on the surveys too for Plectrizia. That was a hard pickup. I'm aware of the time. We're about 10 minutes over time, but we will go to questions and then we will just bump our recommencement time back by about 5 minutes to make sure everyone has a break. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. As with last time, Joe's going to be handling that just so you have a different face and a different voice.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Are you going to unshare me?
You should be able to unshare it yourself, Jeremy.
I should be able to. Hold on. Yes, there we go.
Yeah, there's one back. There we go.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just get the questions back up. There we go. So there was one question from Paul to Mark Clifton, but he's answered it in the chat if you'd like to have a look. It was about, it was about clonal populations where they're flowering and producing seed. So if you have a look at that.
I don't think everyone can see that, Joe. I think that might have just been, I think that might have just been one-on-one.
Oh, righto. Thank you. Thanks for letting me know that. Okay, I'll read it out. It's from Paul. Mark, it looked like the clonal populations were flowering and producing seed. Does this confirm they do not need to outcross?
It doesn't confirm that they're sexual or asexual. So we're thinking that apomixis may be happening, but we don't know if they can reproduce sexually as well. So that's something we're actually going to be looking at. So seed is being produced and the progeny seems to be clonal and have the same genotype as the parental, like this, the plant that the seed's coming off. So we're not sure whether it can reproduce sexually, or whether it may produce. You can have apomictic plants that are facultative apomixed, and they can reproduce sexually and via apomixis. So we're just not sure what's happening there. We're actually doing studies on reproductive mechanisms in the taxon. So hopefully we'll have some answers to that in a year or two.
Great, thanks, Mark. The next question's for you again. It's from Jeremy. What's going on with blue? I hope you understand what I'm saying. What's going on with blue for sub-A in structure? And are you going to do dart and pop gen on the seedlings?
Yeah. I think what Jeremy's referring to is the structure bar graph I showed when K equaled 4. So you had two subulatus populations, and they both showed different genomic clusters. So we determined K equals 4 to be the optimal K value. And that was based on the fact that we had very small sample numbers with Callistemon kenmorrisonii. Our delta K value was actually 2 as the optimal K value, and that put both subulatus groups into the same cluster. So that may have been a higher level of hierarchy within structure. But at K equals 4, I think perhaps they were separated due to the geographic isolation of the two subulatus populations. So they were sampled from quite a long way away from each other, basically, and that's why we might be seeing that different cluster coming in.
Great. Thanks, Mark. The next two questions were actually for Paul, who's unfortunately not here today. Maybe we can pass those on to him and see if we can get some responses back for you after the symposium today. So Ian's got a very long question. Have we got time for this, Sean?
I think that's going to be a discussion point. It's a really great point. Thank you, Ian, and taken a note and will be passed on. Yes, and we'll compile all this, by the way, and send it out.
There's a question from Matt for Heidi. Did you have sufficient data to evaluate any of these species under criterion E?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. I was naughty and I answered it in the chat.
Oh, that's okay.
But in short, no, we don't know a whole lot about these species. And so I wasn't confident to assess under criterion E. It'll probably be, sorry for the IUCN talk, it'll probably be mainly criterion A, which is population reduction, and criterion B, which is geographic distribution, as that's the criterion B is what most Australian plants are eligible for.
One from Andrew to Mark Clifton. Are you looking at potential pollinators? Presumably there are likely fire impacts on those populations too.
I would assume that they have been impacted by the fires, most definitely. We aren't actually looking at potential pollinators at the moment. We have, however, done some inflorescence isolation studies. So we've bagged flowers to isolate the flowers from pollinators and see if seed capsules and seed is developed. And we have found that seed is developed when no pollination has occurred. So this gives an indication whether it's apomictic or it might be selfing. So we're not sure between those two, but when we do flow cytometry, we'll be able to determine which it is.
Thanks, Mark. One for Mark Graham. Where are forestry burning closed forest and on what scale?
Okay, in recent days at Conglomerate, where they bulldozed and clear-felled subtropical rainforest into big piles and then burnt it. In latter times, or longer ago, Clouds Creek, Ellis and Wild Cattle Creek were intentionally, Gondwana forest systems were intentionally burnt. In the case of Ellis and Clouds, a multiple kilometre long burning operation was undertaken, seemingly to shift those forests from rainforest mesic communities into more sclerophyllous communities to over time shift them to make them more available to logging. That particular operation was actually what created the Liberation Trail fire, which destroyed about 100 houses at Nimboida. Thankfully, nobody died. We have significant on-ground evidence of that, and the documentation of forestry's operational standards and procedures in terms of burn plans and that type of stuff. What's occurred to the Dorrigo Plateau with forestry corporations' burning regimes is a global tragedy in recent years.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more from Chantel. For Jenny, what species has been the most difficult to establish, and are there any tricks to share for others setting up a threatened species spa?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, some of the Rutaceae species are still difficult to get into in propagation from seed. We're making a lot of progress with the orchid species that we didn't used to be able to propagate, but we've put inroads into those. So we've propagated the nymphoides, the water lilies. Some things it's not propagation so much as finding the suitable habitat to put them back. So the threats that were there in the first place remain, and so where there's small roadside populations, ingress with weeds, and so we'll look for suitable places on heritage agreements and in parks to create new populations of those.
Great, thanks very much, Jenny. I think we'll conclude the questions there. There's still lots of comments there in the chat for you to read, and some links as well, and messages of support for some of our speakers, which is very nice. Back to you, Sean.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the speakers. We are over time, but we are going to have a 5-minute break because I'm sure everybody needs it. And then we'll join back in at, let's say, 10:02. Presenters in the next session, I might get you to quickly check your screen sharing while we're just having a break. AJ, I know you've been patiently waiting there. So thanks, everyone, for joining. Let's have a 5-minute break and come back.